Buick has been one of the great names in American automobiles for virtually all of the 20th century. Its model names like Century, Roadmaster, and Riviera evoke fond memories. But its founder, David Buick, and several of his successors have had to hang on tight as Buick's fortunes rode the unpredictable roller coaster of world events. It's been quite a ride for Buick. Early in the 20th century, more than 1,000 automobile companies emerged. Most were little more than daydreams and quickly failed. A few prospered for several years, some for decades, but only a handful still exist. Buick, one of the lucky survivors, was founded by an inventive Scotsman, David Dunbar Buick. Born in a small industrial town in 1854, David Buick emigrated with his family to the United States 2 years later. He became a successful plumbing inventor and manufacturer in Detroit, but his real passion wasn't porcelain, it was engines. He said, "You can't drive a bathtub into town." In the mid-1890s, he turned his attention to building gasoline engines. He started a succession of companies that initially produced engines for farm machinery. Buick was a commodore in the Detroit Yacht Club and helped to transform their sailboats into motorboats with his engines. Around 1900, one of Buick's employees, Walter Marr, built the first Buick automobile in the barn behind David Buick's Detroit house. Buick and Marr were a lot alike. Both were about 5'4" and had hot tempers. They often argued with each other. When they split up for a brief period in 1901, Buick tried to sell their first car to Marr. He wanted $300, but Marr held out and finally got it for $225. But Marr was back soon. He would work for David Buick 3 times. Buick and Marr then raised the money to build a second car. The car had problems, and their investor wanted to unload the company and get his $3,500 investment back. Horsepower was still the norm, and most people were wary of making a speculative investment in automobile manufacturing. But enough automobiles were appearing on major city streets by 1903 that some were willing to take the financial plunge. By that summer, Buick found a group of wagon makers in Flint, Michigan, who would take the risk and buy his company. By then, Flint was a prosperous city of 14,000 people, located on the edge of the great Michigan pine forests. The money from lumbering had fueled several local enterprises. The most successful, wagon and carriage building, would ironically provide the financial basis for their competition, the automobile. By the turn of the century, several of the wagon makers had determined that if the horseless carriage was going to be a threat to their business, they'd better get aboard. By September of 1903, the new investors had moved the Buick Company, baggage, and David Buick from Detroit to Flint. The Buick Motor Car Company was born. It was the right time to enter the auto business. Through endurance demonstrations such as the Glidden Tour, the public was becoming convinced that cars could take the punishment of the road. People began to believe that automobiles were durable and practical forms of transportation. Auto racing was also becoming a popular form of amusement. Thousands of people would flock to weekend races, such as the one held by the Vanderbilts on Long Island, to see the daredevils compete. The racing fans left the track excited about the future of the automobile. In the spring of 1904, David Buick desperately wanted to cash in on this enthusiasm. He enticed Walter Marr to rejoin him and help him build the first Flint Buick automobile. Marr and David's son took the car, basically a running chassis, on a test run to Detroit and back. They started July 9, 1904, and returned 3 days later, about a 3-hour round trip today. The new investors soon learned that developing an automobile company was more expensive than they'd realized. The company ran into financial problems in the fall of 1904. They turned to Billy Durant, one of Flint's other carriage builders, for help. Durant was a legend in Flint. He seemed to have the ability to produce almost magical business success. Although not a Flint native, his roots were there. Durant, the grandson of a Flint lumber baron and Michigan governor, was born in Boston on December 8, 1861. He moved to a fine house in Flint with his mother, Rebecca Durant, a decade later when his mother and father separated. He was a restless child who dropped out of high school to work in his grandfather's lumber mill. He quickly decided he didn't like hard labor. But the slightly built young man had a knack for selling and business. He successfully sold patent medicine, cigars, insurance, and real estate. In 1886, he got into the vehicle business, almost on a whim. One evening in September, he saw an attractive horse-drawn road cart on the streets of Flint. The next night, he took the train to Coldwater, Michigan, where the cart was manufactured, and bought the rights to build it, along with its patented spring suspension. He borrowed $2,000 and started the Blue Ribbon Carriage Company with a partner and close friend, J. Dallas Dort. By 1900, they were the largest producers of horse-drawn vehicles in the country. Durant was a promoter and a super salesman. He talked softly, had a dazzling smile, and as Walter Chrysler later said, he could charm a bird right down out of a tree. Durant and Dort became millionaires. Durant succeeded by buying and combining component companies and placing them under the Durant-Dort empire. Durant bought wheel, axle, varnish, paint, and carriage top companies and moved them to Flint. But in the early 1900s, Durant became bored and left Flint for New York City. He played the stock market and looked for new challenges, but he couldn't entirely escape from Flint. In 1904, the restless Durant was approached by old friends and asked to come home and rescue financially strapped Buick. It would be a tough decision to make. By 1904, the automobile was making its mark in American cities. While Durant didn't particularly like automobiles, an opinion shared by most carriage builders, he recognized their growing popularity. He agreed to return to Flint to have a look at Buick. In Flint, Durant took a Buick out for a spin. The Buick climbed hills and ran through mud like nothing else he'd ever seen. If automobiles could be this good, he decided, it was time to get out of the carriage business. Durant agreed to take over Buick and turn the experiment into a viable company. No one else could raise money, sell products, and plan big organizations like Billy Durant. Buick's success seemed to be assured. On November 3rd, 1904, 2 days after taking over, he hauled out every Buick that had been built and staged a parade in downtown Flint, complete with a brass band and tooting bugles. Even though he didn't have a booth, Durant went to the New York Auto Show in January of 1905. He took orders for more than 1,000 Buicks. The company hadn't even built 40. With these orders in hand, he raised enough money from Flint's banks and business people to build the country's largest assembly facility. The new plant launched a migration to Flint, but there wasn't enough local housing for all of the new workers, and a shanty town developed. Eventually, Buick would have to build houses for its growing workforce. Using Durant-Dort carriage outlets and salespeople as the nucleus of a giant distribution system, Durant began to promote Buicks across the country. His efforts paid off. Buick production grew rapidly. His new Buick factory produced over 750 cars in 1905. By 1906, Buick had 2 models and was building almost 1,300 cars a year. 1 year later, there were 6 models, and output had increased to 4,600 cars. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced his famous Model T just as America really started to accept the automobile. The fledgling car industry was clearly on its way, and the race was on to be number 1. Buick also produced a significant new model that year. It was the cute and popular Model 10. Buick produced 4,000 Model 10 runabouts in 1908 and 4,820 other cars. This made Buick the #1 producer of automobiles in the country. Buick outsold Ford and Cadillac, its 2 closest rivals, combined. Durant had made the jump from leading producer of carriages to leading producer of automobiles. To keep the spotlight on his cars, he sponsored a racing team. The Buick racing team began to gather trophies and headlines across the country. The stars of the team were Louis Chevrolet and Wild Bob Berman. They would win more than 500 races and keep Buick's name in the papers. The Buick 60 Specials, one each for Louis Chevrolet and Bob Berman, were aerodynamic cars that went faster than 105 miles per hour. Unofficially, they were called the Buick Bugs. Their racing exploits pumped up Buick sales. For a country that was largely rural and still relied on the horse, these demonstrations of speed were exciting, like nothing else people had ever seen. To keep their cars in the limelight in 1911 and further demonstrate the durability and practicality of a Buick, the company sponsored the first attempt at driving from San Francisco to Reno, Nevada. Reno's Chamber of Commerce welcomed the idea and envisioned a day when carloads of Californian tourists would visit. But in 1911, the road to Reno was treacherous. At the lower elevations, the drivers encountered soft, wet snow. But as they climbed the steep Sierra slopes, the snow turned to ice. Sleds had to be built, and the car was wrestled over a crest with a combination of muscle, motor, and willpower. Even when they started their descent into a more moderate climate, ropes were needed to pull them through the underbrush. As they closed in on their destination, they planted a flag to commemorate their trip. The tired crew made it to Reno, But it would be many years until the Chamber of Commerce could realize its dream of a drove of tourists swarming in from California. The driver's efforts, though, provided further proof that the auto would prevail over the horse. While Buick was the #1 auto manufacturer, Durant wanted more. He began to formulate his ideas for an auto empire. The success of Henry Ford's Model T and the genius of its inventor has led many to believe that its impact was a foregone conclusion when it was introduced in 1908. But Henry Ford, while confident, didn't know the scope of what he'd done. Durant, though, had a feeling. He approached Ford and offered to buy him out. Ford's operations were bursting at the seams, and he was facing the daunting prospect of raising the money to build a new factory. Durant's offer was tantalizing. Ford agreed to sell, but he wanted cash, $8 million. Durant tried to raise the money, but his audacious appetite staggered his bankers' imaginations. Pierpont Morgan and others turned him away. 2 years later, the growing success of Henry's Model T upped Ford's asking price to $35 million. Unfazed by his inability to buy out Ford, Durant soon found another auto company he could acquire, the former low-priced leader, Oldsmobile. The curved-dash Oldsmobile was the first American automobile that had been assembled in large numbers. The company's attempts to diversify its products hadn't worked, and by 1908 the company had fallen on lean times. However, it was still a famous name, and Durant thought he could build on that. He combined Buick and Olds together under a new company called General Motors on September 16, 1908. Durant then acquired the prestigious luxury car line Cadillac and the mid-priced Oakland, forerunner of Pontiac. With an eye on publicity, he lured a famous bicycle racer, Albert Champion, away from the company that bore Champion's name and formed AC Sparkplug. It was rumored that Durant often carried a suitcase stuffed with cash. People said he juggled millions like some gambled with pennies, but most of his deals were engineered as a stock swap. While his fledgling organization acquired dozens of companies, its financial backbone was still Buick. But his growing empire was vulnerable. He became financially overextended and needed $14 million. A group of cautious Boston bankers, led by James Storrow, held the company's future in their hands. While they deliberated about loaning the money to Durant, his operations ground to a halt. With his factories shut down, no money for payroll, and bankruptcy looming, he granted the bankers' demand for such a large block of stock that they became the majority shareholders. They installed his former protege, Charles Nash, as GM's new president. Nash eventually went on to found his own company, the forerunner of American Motors. Within a year, Nash hired someone else who would start a car company, Walter P. Chrysler. Chrysler's engineering and manufacturing expertise laid the basis for a strong Buick organization. Durant had pushed Buick's production to over 30,000 cars in 1910. The interruption of production caused sales to decline to 13,000 in 1911. Nash and Chrysler had their work cut out for them. Durant did not spend much time sulking. He teamed up with his former race driver, Louis Chevrolet, and started the Chevrolet Company in 1911. But Louis's constantly burning cigarette bothered Billy, who insisted that if a gentleman must smoke, he should at least smoke cigars. Personalities aside, they also disagreed about the car. Durant wanted a small, light car to compete with the #1 seller, Ford's Model T. Louis wanted something grander. Durant got his way by redesigning and repricing the car when Louis was away on a European trip that Durant had conveniently arranged. The car was out by the time Louis returned. The public loved it, but Louis didn't like the car that bore his name, and there was a parting of the ways. But once again, Durant's instincts were right. The Chevrolet took off. It was soon outselling GM and challenging Ford. From Chevrolet's headquarters in the old Flint Wagon Works building, Durant started to quietly buy back GM stock. It was during this time that Durant met Johnny Raskob, the very astute confidant and advisor of one of America's richest men, Pierre DuPont. Raskob convinced DuPont to invest in Chevrolet and General Motors, something he would continue to do. By 1916, the automobile was firmly established on the streets of America. DuPont saw the growth potential and was happy to join Durant's efforts. Durant wanted DuPont's help in recapturing General Motors. With the stock he'd bought with Chevrolet's profits and the DuPont's support, he effectively took back control of GM in 1916. The bankers were out. Durant's return stunned the business world. The DuPonts continued to buy GM shares and consolidate their interests. For the time being, Durant was back at the helm, and GM once again grew rapidly. He added a research division, Delco Laboratories, the inventors of the self-starter. He also bought many component companies and secured the services of the Fisher Brothers Bodybuilding Company. But even with all this expansion, Buick was still GM's main asset. Now that Durant was back, Nash resigned. Durant retained Walter Chrysler and made him president of Buick. America was soon off to war, and one of Walter Chrysler's first challenges was to help Buick gear up to produce armaments. Buick built thousands of Liberty aircraft engines, ambulances, and a new weapon, tanks. It was a terrible conflict that showed the power and the importance of the machine. Airplanes, tanks, machine guns, and trucks. It was an automated world whose armies were now supplied by factories with seemingly unlimited capacity. But finally, it was over. As the cheering from the victory parades filled the air, the DuPonts started to search for ways to invest the money they had earned selling gunpowder during the war. Durant's own gargantuan appetites were also once again aroused. He began a spending binge that netted him another slew of companies, including a refrigerator manufacturer, Frigidaire. Since every emperor needs a castle, Durant commissioned a new headquarters for General Motors. Of course, it would be the world's largest office building. Buick was doing its part to keep the money rolling in. The Buicks looked better than the staid Model Ts and were chipping away at the lead Ford's cars had developed. Then, a post-war depression put an abrupt halt to Durant's plans. Attempting to prop up GM's declining share price, Durant bought its stock on margin, but the stock kept falling, and eventually his creditors demanded their money. He owed $27 million, money he no longer had. Pierre DuPont offered Durant $35 million for his remaining shares. This would pay off the creditors, but he would lose his company. He had no choice. Durant took the deal and went home. The DuPonts now controlled General Motors, the largest auto paint supplier, a portion of United States Steel, and soon they'd form a syndicate to control United States Rubber. It was a new era at GM and at Buick. The 1920s started roaring, and Americans had money to spend. Florida real estate was booming. People were going to the beach and playing golf. Speakeasies were busy, even though gangsters controlled the flow of illicit alcohol. It was a time of growth and abandon. Both Buick and GM were in line to reap the rewards of the era. The DuPonts appointed Alfred Sloan to the GM presidency to stabilize the company and provide a solid foundation for the future. The 1 millionth Buick was built in 1923. Annual production reached 260,000 units in 1926. Cars such as the $2,100 Opera Coupe combined reliability with luxury. Features like power-operated windshield wipers and silk window shades set Buicks apart. Sloan had carefully structured General Motors so that its automobiles formed a graduated product lineup. Buick took its place just behind the Cadillac. The Buicks in the 1920s rivaled Cadillac in size, power, reliability, and style. As Buick's reputation grew, Flint prospered. Its thriving theater district featured the latest Hollywood films and the major vaudevillians, including George Burns and Gracie Allen.
George, I know a little about a train.
You do? I mean,
Yes.
the minute you see a train, you know right away it's a train.
You want to hear it?
A little. Let's have it.
All right. Look, at the first station, 4 people get on and 3 people get off.
Yes.
And at the second station, 5 people get on and 6 people get off.
Yes.
How many people get on the third station?
How many people? Well, I give up. How many people got on at the first station?
Oh, I don't know. I get off at the second station.
The laughter began to fade on October 29th of 1929, when Wall Street crashed. More than 12 million shares changed hands in a single day. An estimated $50 billion was lost that day as millions of people saw their savings disappear. Banks closed and the real estate boom collapsed. The car makers soon felt the result of Wall Street's decline. As a maker of near-luxury automobiles, Buick was harder hit by the country's economic troubles than some of its competitors. Buick responded by introducing a smaller, more economical car line called the Marquette. Its engines and drivetrains were less expensive than the standard Buicks, but they produced fairly good performance for the times. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 30 seconds and had a top speed of nearly 70 miles per hour. But the public and the Buick dealers never warmed up to the Marquette, and after building 35,000, the car was dropped. Buick's sister division at General Motors, Oakland, had also introduced a low-cost version of their product. Their car, called the Pontiac, eventually supplanted the parent organization. By 1933, Buick production had plummeted to a little more than 40,000 units. Flint was a ghost town. Thousands were thrown out of work. But late that year, Harlow H. Curtis, the 39-year-old president of AC Sparkplug, was tapped by GM to change Buick's fortunes. A super salesman in the Durant mold, Red Curtis, nicknamed for his red hair, brought power, speed, and sales back to Buick. As part of his efforts, Curtis issued a challenge to GM's chief designer, who always drove Cadillacs. Curtis said, "Design a Buick you would like to own." The result was a line of Buicks that pushed sales close to 200,000 cars. While Buick was off relief, Flint was about to explode. In December of 1936, the famous Flint sit-down strike paralyzed auto production, just as the economy was starting to pick up. The workers complained about the speed of the assembly line, the long, grueling hours, and the lack of any benefits. Violence erupted as the strike dragged on. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The strike resulted in GM's recognition of the United Auto Workers as a bargaining agent. Local 599 at Buick became the UAW's largest GM local. The dark financial cloud started to lift at Buick in 1940. It would break its 1928 sales record and sell over 250,000 cars. New models were being prepared, and Curtis was upbeat about the future. Buick's traditional customers responded to the cars, and Buick was confident that it knew what people wanted: quality, good taste, social acceptance, and value. Buick's renewed confidence had given rise to GM's first dream car, called the Buick Y-Job. It featured striking aerodynamic styling, including inset headlamps and no running boards, and such innovations as electric windows and a flush-mounted convertible cover. While America was once again dreaming, war was becoming a reality in Europe and Asia. As the war began, it became clear that America would be drawn into the conflict. To speed up the production of armaments for the conflict, President Roosevelt organized American industry under the leadership of the former president of General Motors, Bill Knudsen. Many manufacturers were reluctant to convert their operations to weapons production. After suffering through nearly a decade-long economic depression, they were finally making money again. But after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when America entered the war, industry responded. Buick halted production of its 1942 models and became part of the arsenal of democracy. Buick built aircraft engines, Hellcat tank destroyers, and other military hardware. Buick was awarded more than 30 separate military contracts. Buick-built material could be found at virtually every fighting front. By the time the war finally ended, the employees of Buick had produced more than 424,000 steel cartridge cases, 19,000 tank powertrains, 9 million 20-millimeter shells, 2,500 Hellcat tank destroyers, and 2,900 mounts for anti-aircraft guns. While it was time to celebrate, Curtiss wanted to start building Buicks again. After the war, Curtiss pushed Buick to reconvert its production lines and deliver new cars to the public. He launched a huge expansion effort, adding 1.3 million feet of factory space, enough room to build 550,000 cars. Curtiss saw a bright future for Buick. His efforts were rewarded in 1952 when he became GM's president. Buick once again had a good friend in high places. While it was going to be a great era for the American economy, its foes and allies had both suffered the effects of the war. Europe and Japan were buried under mountains of rubble and faced the prospect of many lean years. It would be a long time before they could challenge the economic dominance of the United States. The United States manufacturing base had escaped unscathed and was more productive than ever, but some feared that complacency would set in. The post-war era was America's moment in the sun. Opportunity was everywhere, and prosperity was a given. Rationing had been lifted. Sugar, coffee, produce, and nylon stockings, everything that had been denied during the war was now available. People flocked to the well-stocked stores. Gasoline and tires were also finally obtainable again, and people couldn't wait to buy a new car. Buick introduced new models and saw Curtiss's prediction that they would sell more than 500,000 cars a year realized. A major concern for the automakers was how to keep track of all the money that was rolling in. New ways had to be invented to monitor the staggering profits. Finance became more important than product development at the car companies. At Buick and elsewhere, technological innovation took a backseat to styling. These large Land Cruisers were fairly unsophisticated mechanically, but they had a certain appeal. A dollop of chrome here and a splash of color there was enough to set American hearts racing in the 1950s. Detroit was selling dreams, and a succession of show cars fostered American fantasies. The Buick XP 300 and LeSabre were long and low. Their jet age look was perfectly in tune with the times. As sales soared, quality started to decline. No one really noticed for years because there were very few foreign cars for comparison. The few foreign cars that made it into the U.S. were owned by enthusiasts. Initially, they had very little impact on the market. Most Detroit executives dismissed or even derided the imports. Buick rode the buoyant tide of ever-increasing sales. Buick sales rose rapidly to 550,000 in 1950 and to 745,000 in 1955. In 1955, Buick ranked third in industry sales. Its famous portholes were being seen everywhere. But in 1958, the dream started to fade. The cars had become too bloated and laden with chrome, even for the American consumer. The aversion to the styling excesses of the decade and an economic downturn sent sales spiraling. Buick started searching for new designs. In 1959, Buick changed the names and shapes of its entire production line, discarding Special, Century, Super, and Roadmaster in favor of LeSabre, Invicta, and Electra. But more had to be done. While Buick was developing its new products, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the DuPont family must divest itself of its GM holdings. This case had been fought for years, but finally the courts forced the DuPonts out. Buick, along with GM, began a new decade and a new era. The recession of 1958 had made small cars popular, and Buick introduced the Special, a compact car with an aluminum V8 engine in 1961. The following year, Buick offered the first production V6 in the Special. Buick's large cars were also new that year, and boosted by a reviving economy, total sales climbed to more than 450,000 cars. In 1963, the Riviera, considered a modern classic today, was introduced. Buick sales continued to rise through the 1960s and hit a record 821,165 in the 1973 model year. In these go-go years, Buick abandoned its six-cylinder engines and gave the public ever bigger and more powerful V8s. But the bottom fell out again with the oil embargo late in 1973, and sales sank below 500,000 in both 1974 and 75. Buick would have to change or go under. When the American public flocked to small, fuel-efficient imports, they discovered something Detroit had abandoned: quality. Consumers started to forsake their allegiance to their domestic cars. Buick, along with the rest of the American auto industry, started to search for a winning response. Buick once again recognized the importance of fuel economy and reintroduced the fuel-efficient V6. It had to repurchase the tooling from American Motors, which had bought it in the late 60s for use in its small cars. No one at Buick was sure if the public would respond to the slimmer, trimmer, fuel-friendly American cars. They did, and Buick started a slow climb back up the sales ladder. When most of the U.S. auto industry suffered a sales slump due to the high interest rates and rising gasoline prices of the early 1980s, Buick actually increased its market share. During this era, Buick and the rest of the industry was pressured to develop numerous safety features, pollution controls, and engineering innovations for fuel economy. This meant building even smaller, more aerodynamic front-wheel drive cars. But smaller didn't necessarily mean underpowered. Buick's turbo-powered V6 engines helped to convince American consumers that they could abandon their beloved gas-hungry V8s without sacrificing performance. While Buick had weathered the tumult of the 70s, the need for change didn't let up in the 1980s. The competition from high-quality, fuel-efficient European and Japanese cars was now acute. To build the new cars Buick needed to compete required a complete renovation of its factories. Buick's old plant, the cornerstone of General Motors, was converted at a cost of $350 million. It became known as Buick City. A team of hourly and salaried workers came together to design the plant and create a new direction for the company, a far cry from the days of the sit-down strikes. While confrontation wasn't completely gone, it was clear to many that cooperation would be necessary for the future. The results began to show. By 1989, the Buick LeSabre was ranked as the #1 American car, and as the number 2 car among 154 domestics and imports sold in the United States. After years of turmoil, it was clear that Buick was once again building premium American motor cars. There were some setbacks. The 2-seat luxury sports car, the Riata, only lasted for a few years after its 1988 debut. The front-wheel drive Regals, Buick's bread-and-butter family sedans, were trounced by Mercury's Sable and the upscale imports. And a return to a large rear-drive car with a great old name, the 1992 Roadmaster sedan, was cut short when GM closed the plant. But there were also some successes. Cars such as the elegant Park Avenue continued to show that Buick was alive and well. To many observers, the clear signal that Buick was back as an automotive leader came in 1993 with the introduction of the restyled Riviera. When longtime Buick employees saw the car emerge from the design studios, they knew that Buick was once again asserting itself as a forward-looking company. The renewed emphasis on quality and style has once again put Buick on a path that would have made David Buick and Billy Durant proud.